Everyone, it's Pastor Keith, and I'm here to talk about Easter. In fact, we're about a week away from Easter, and I want to just answer some questions regarding the topic of Easter. We as a church love Easter. In fact, I love Easter. In fact, it's been called the Super Bowl Sunday for churches because more people attend church on Easter. But many people don't know the roots and the history behind the name Easter or why we celebrate it around the time of the year. I remember growing up enjoying Easter. My mom used to get my sister and I Easter egg baskets, and we would get all kinds of trinkets or things that we wanted in them and candy, and it was always a fun memory for me, but I had no clue of what it meant. I didn't grow up going to church on Sundays or particularly at the Easter season, but we did remember that specific holiday. In fact, all over the world people celebrate it. So why do we celebrate it at the time of the year that we do? Like, why does it change? Why is it sometimes in March or at the end of April or at the beginning of April? Well, if we go back, the early church fathers wished to keep the observance of the reminder of the resurrection of Jesus at the Passover. In fact, we're reminded the night that Jesus was betrayed, the day before his death, was the Passover meal. It was the Passover feast that Jesus would give the reminder of the Lord's Supper or communion. So as we would remember the resurrection of Jesus, it would happen during the same season of the Jewish Passover, which we also celebrate. We're reminded of the faithfulness of God and that story of the Passover that we read in the book of Exodus. So because the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus happened during the time of the Passover or shortly after the Passover, the early church fathers wanted to keep that reminder as the same. So where does the name Easter come from? Well, the name Easter, the root is actually in a polytheistic religion, which essentially could be called paganism. You will never find the word Easter in the Bible. In fact, its roots have no biblical meaning whatsoever. Scholars agree on this, that it has no biblical significance whatsoever. For these reasons, some Christians have a problem with the name Easter because it has no association with Jesus. So some people want to call the day that we celebrate Easter Resurrection Sunday to remind us that Jesus is not dead, but he is resurrected. But we as a church believe that's every Sunday. The reason we gather together on Sundays is to remind ourselves that it's the Lord's day. It's the day that he was resurrected and alive, and that we could be alive in him too. But Easter is derived actually from the term Eastre, which is a Teutonic goddess. In fact, she was the moon goddess, and it dates way back where this goddess was celebrated. It has German roots in the Germanic calendar. One writer stated that it would kind of be a month-long feast around the season of April or spring, and they would eat food and celebrate what spring represents, new life, fertility, which this moon goddess would represent. But this season, or this celebration rather, didn't last for long. In fact, all over the world, many people don't know the roots, that that's what the name Easter means, that it's associated with a pagan goddess. Why? Why did this goddess seem to fade in oblivion, yet the name still exists? I would state that it's probably because of Jesus. The movement of following Jesus, Christianity, has spread across the world. In fact, it has turned the world upside down. The world is no longer the same because of Jesus. And so now at Easter, instead of thinking or talking about a pagan goddess, we focus on Jesus. And that's exactly what we do as a church. I'm unashamed to say at Easter we talk about Jesus, because any opportunity we can to talk about Jesus, we do. So where did the Easter egg and the Easter bunny derive from? What meaning does that have to do with anything? Well, the rabbit has always been known for a symbol of sexual fertility. That dates back long ago, and it's kind of sad because the rabbit's cute, but you hear a lot of jokes about that even in our modern culture, and in various parts of the world and various religions, in places like China and Egypt, even today, the rabbit has a symbol of fertility. And if you date back, all the way back to the first book of the Bible, we learn about these things when mankind has always had pride, and you see that God would scatter mankind because they were building this tower of Babel, that God would essentially not tolerate that, because our God is one God and he wants to be worshiped because he created us in his image. But unfortunately, we see different religions birthed out of that, and we see all over the world a misunderstanding of these things. So is it wrong to celebrate the Easter egg? Is that just a pagan form of celebrating fertility? Well, here's what I would say. As a kid, when I used to search for Easter eggs and collect them in my Easter basket, I had no clue about those roots of a goddess named Easter, who would be the goddess of the moon, and that the bunny rabbit would have some symbol of fertility, that they would parallel with each other. I didn't do those things, nor did my mother, and nor do many people when they go out and do these things. However, I would say sometimes they take the focus off of Jesus. But one of the things we look at in the Bible is there was a guy named Paul that wrote most of the New Testament who discovered a life in Jesus. And one of the things he would tell the Romans who would discover Jesus as well, that whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. Whether you eat or drink, do it all for the glory of God. In fact, Paul, when he would tell people about Jesus who would worship these pagan gods, once he was in Athens, and you could read a story in Acts chapter 17 where Paul was visiting the city Athens, and they had all kinds of false gods and goddesses. And what he would say as you read that chapter in Athens, he would address them. And he didn't condemn them. He didn't shame them. He didn't say how horrible they were for worshiping these false gods and goddesses. But rather he would say this. It says in chapter 17, verse 22 in the book of Acts. So Paul, standing in the midst, said, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you're religious." So he acknowledged their traditions, but then he said this, "For I passed along and observed objects of your worship. I found also an altar with the inscription, 'To the unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you.'" Then he would go on to point them to Jesus. He went on to give kind of a historical picture of Jesus always being God, and how God would step out of heaven into the man, Jesus, and how he would live this life so that he would pay the penalty for their sin. And so it is at Easter. So many people don't know the truth of a real God. But many people worship an unknown God, sometimes in the form of an Easter egg, sometimes in the form of money or sex or many other things in our culture. But Easter is a chance for us where people will attend church on Easter, whereas unlike any other Sunday, they may not. So why not capitalize on this and point people to Jesus, just like Paul did in Acts chapter 17 to the Athenians? So that's what we do on Easter. Will we have Easter eggs at church on Easter Sunday? We sure will. But you know what we'll do for the kids that Sunday is we'll point them to Jesus. We're going to do a story of the resurrection through the eggs and point kids to who Jesus is, what he did for them, and how he died. And on that Sunday, he was resurrected on the third day. And what we'll do for the adults as well, we'll have a fun, lighthearted message pointing people to Jesus and letting them know about Jesus, how he died and how he's resurrected. And will we call it Easter? We will. But we don't worship the pagan goddess, but rather what we do is on that day that was intended for evil, we will use it for good. And we see that story throughout God's story, the Bible. We see that with Joseph. Circumstance after circumstance, they were intended for evil. But in the end, it would point to God. And Joseph would say, what you intended for evil, God would use for good. And so that's what we want to do on Easter as well. So I hope that answers some questions about what Easter is, why we celebrate it at Journey Church, and ultimately what we want people to see, which is Jesus. So I look forward to seeing you on Easter Sunday. We're starting 2 services, 9 a.m. and 10:30 a.m. We want you to invite your friends. We want you to let them know that there's a church that you can come as you are. It's filled with people just like them. So we look forward to seeing you there. Make sure to invite someone, and I'll see you Easter Sunday. Bye-bye.